She's just the help, Clarissa said flatly, waving her diamond-ringed hand toward me as the waiter approached our table. Don't worry about her order. I froze. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. But the waiter's puzzled glance at me confirmed it. I hadn't. She'd said it loud enough for the two women seated behind us to look up from their salads. Loud enough for the child at the table next to us to ask his mum, "What's the help?" The worst part. My daughter Grace didn't flinch, didn't correct her, didn't even glance my way. I had worn my best blouse, tied my hair in the neat, low bun my late husband always loved. I even brought a wrapped gift, a delicate brooch Grace had once admired in my jewelry box. It was Mother's Day, my first one without Henry. I had been invited out by my daughter and her husband. I thought it was to celebrate me, but there I was, standing in a five-star restaurant in San Francisco, being reduced to an afterthought, to a servant, by my own daughter-in-law, and they both pretended like it hadn't happened. The waiter looked at me hesitant, unsure. Clarissa turned her gaze back to the menu, all confidence and gloss like she ran the world. And maybe she did, at least in Grace's world. If you were me, what would you have done? Would you have stood up and said something? Walked out or smiled through it like I did for one last time? Let me know in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how many women out there have ever been mistaken for less than who they are. My name is Lorraine Mitchell. I'm 67 years old, and I used to be a public school teacher in Oregon for over 30 years. I raised two children, Grace and Lucas, largely on my own, after my husband Henry passed away from a heart condition just 3 years into his retirement. We had dreams, Henry and I. We'd saved up to take a trip to Italy, to renovate the kitchen, to maybe adopt a golden retriever once the grandkids were older. But those dreams got tucked away when he left, and I poured myself into my family instead. When Grace married Clarissa 5 years ago, I welcomed her with open arms. Clarissa came from a wealthier family, old San Francisco money, according to Grace, and she worked in high-end corporate real estate. She had this calm, polished way of speaking like she was always on stage. But I tried. I baked her the lemon poppy seed cake she once said she liked. I watched her dog when they traveled. I showed up. Every time. Birthdays. Anniversaries. Even when I wasn't invited, I made excuses just to see Grace. I lived in a small in-law unit behind Grace's house. After Henry passed, Grace offered it to me, or rather she said Clarissa agreed it would be okay if you stayed there for a bit. I was touched. I sold our house and handed the money to Grace to help pay off their mortgage. She insisted, said it would be more practical that way, and that I wouldn't have to worry about anything else. I believed her. Because when your daughter says you don't need to worry anymore, Mom, we've got you. You believe her. But slowly, things began to shift. At first it was small. Clarissa not saying good morning. Clarissa making jokes like, "Well, she lives here rent-free, so," with a dry smile. Then came the moments where I'd be cooking and she'd say, "Oh, we don't really need all that old-fashioned stuff anymore." When I offered to help set the table for their dinner party one evening, she looked at me and said, "Actually, we're trying to keep it more intimate." You understand, right? But I always smiled. I told myself she's just adjusting. Maybe she's stressed. Maybe she'll warm up eventually. Because I didn't want to be the difficult mother-in-law. I didn't want to be a burden. Then came the invitation to the Mother's Day brunch. It was sent as a text, "Join us for Mother's Day, 12 p.m. at La Vie." No, we can't wait to see you, no personal touch. Still, I dressed up. I put on the brooch Henry gave me on our 40th anniversary. I practiced, smiling in the mirror, told myself today would be different. But when I walked into the restaurant, Clarissa didn't even stand. Grace gave me a quick side hug while checking her phone. I sat down, folded my napkin, and said, "You both look lovely." Clarissa blinked at me. "Thanks," she said flatly, sipping her mimosa. The menu was in French. I tried to ask a question about one of the entrees, and Clarissa leaned over to the waiter and whispered, "She's just the help." And that's where this story truly begins. After that brunch, something shifted in me. Or maybe it had been shifting all along, and I just ignored it to keep the illusion alive. Clarissa's words, "She's just the help," didn't leave my mind. They echoed while I washed dishes, while I folded laundry, while I watered the flowers in the backyard I once helped Grace plant. But it wasn't just the words. It was how no one corrected her. The waiter blinked, half smiled politely and carried on. Grace didn't even glance at me. That silence. That was worse than the insult itself. That was complicity. In the weeks that followed, the insults grew not in volume, but in subtlety. I began to notice how Clarissa introduced me to their friends. "This is Lorraine. She lives on the property," she'd say, with the same tone someone might use to introduce a long-time housekeeper. At a backyard barbecue, someone asked me if I had a key to the house. Clarissa chuckled and said, "Oh, Lorraine doesn't really need one. She's got her little corner out back. They stopped asking if I wanted anything from the store when they did grocery runs." Once Clarissa ordered sushi for the whole house and left a sticky note on my door that said, "There's soup in the freezer." You know how raw fish isn't your thing. At first I kept justifying it. Maybe they were busy. Maybe Clarissa had grown up differently. Maybe Grace didn't notice. But the turning point came when I offered to help babysit during a work conference they were both attending. Clarissa looked at me and said, "We actually prefer a professional." "No offense, Lorraine, it's just, things are done a certain way these days." "No offense." That phrase became her shield. "No offense, but this style of parenting is a bit outdated." "No offense, but we're trying to keep the vibe more minimalist." "No offense, but she's not used to formal settings." Every time she said it, she chipped a little more off the dignity I'd worked so hard to preserve. The kids, my grandkids, started calling me Miss Lorraine instead of Grandma. I didn't know where it came from. I asked Grace gently one afternoon, and she shrugged. "Clarissa thinks it sets clearer boundaries, so they don't get confused. You're not their full-time caregiver after all." That one hit me hard. I sat on the edge of my bed that night, staring at the faded photo of Henry on my dresser. "You'd be furious," I whispered to it. But what could I do? I didn't have a place to go. The house I paid for was in their names now. The money I gave every last cent of the savings Henry and I had was gone. And so I kept folding laundry. I kept smiling. I kept setting the table when asked and clearing it when no one looked. Until one afternoon I came home and found the door to my in-law unit wide open. My bed gone. My dresser replaced with a small metal rack. My keepsakes boxed and stacked in the basement. I stood there frozen as Clarissa walked past me, phone in hand. "Oh," she said, not even slowing down, "we needed the room for Grace's new studio. You've still got that nice space in the basement." We figured it made more sense. She didn't ask. She didn't warn me. She moved my life while I was out running errands, without a word. And in that moment, surrounded by boxes of my memories, my years, my worth, I realized something: I was no longer a part of their family. I had become background noise, something convenient to ignore, or worse, to use. That night I didn't sleep in the basement. I couldn't. The air was cold damp, with the kind of moisture that crept into your bones and made every breath feel like it carried weight. I sat on a worn stool, surrounded by boxes labelled Misc and old books, the ones that held the remnants of my life. A lace shawl Henry had bought me from our 20th anniversary trip to Vermont. My nursing certificates from decades ago. The small porcelain ballerina from Grace's third birthday, the one she used to spin endlessly on the coffee table. All crammed into boxes stacked like old inventory. Not a single word from Grace, not a single apology. I finally broke down. Not loud, not dramatic. Just silent tears slipping down my face as I clutched the edge of a cardboard box, my fingers curling like they were holding onto something more than just corrugated paper. I didn't know what part hurt more, being erased so easily, or realizing I'd let it happen piece by piece for years. When I finally climbed the basement stairs the next morning, I found the kitchen bustling. Clarissa was laughing with friends. Grace was cutting fruit. No one noticed me. I cleared my throat. No one turned. I was invisible. I called Carol that night, my old friend from nursing school, who'd moved to Maine years ago. I hadn't spoken to her in a while, always too busy, or too tired, or too ashamed to admit how things had turned out. "Lorraine," she said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" And just like that, the dam broke. I told her everything. The restaurant, the names, the basement, every humiliating detail spilling from my lips like a confession I didn't know I needed to make. There was a long silence on the other end. Then softly she said, "You don't deserve this. Not after everything you gave. You built that home." Her words felt like sunlight through the crack of a cellar window. Small, but warm. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew I couldn't keep living like a shadow of myself. I began sleeping in the basement, not because I accepted it, but because I needed time. Time to think, to feel, to stop pretending that this was normal. Grace didn't come down once. Clarissa left a folded blanket and a scented candle on a shelf one day with a sticky note. "Hope this makes it feel cozier." As if that made it home, I started writing everything down. Every date, every comment, every shift in behavior. Not out of revenge, not yet, but out of the need to remember. Because when they make you feel invisible, the first thing you lose is your sense of what's real. It all came to a head 3 weeks later. Grace's company held an event at the house, a big tech launch for some new healthcare app. Guests flooded the yard. Champagne flowed. And in the center of it all stood Clarissa, wearing a dress that looked like it cost more than my car. I tried to stay out of the way, but a child, one of the guests' daughters, wandered too close to the fire pit. I stepped in quickly, guiding her back toward her mother. The mother smiled warmly and asked, "Are you the family nanny?" Clarissa from behind answered before I could speak. "She's just the help." That was it. That was the moment. I didn't cry this time. I didn't retreat. I simply turned, walked back into the basement, and shut the door. And I made a promise to myself. They may have pushed me into the shadows, but I was about to walk back into the light, and I wasn't coming quietly. That night, instead of crying, I opened an old shoebox tucked behind my nursing textbooks. Inside were faded receipts, a copy of the original house deed, and a safety deposit key Henry had left in a tiny envelope with my name written in his crooked, loving script. For years I had ignored it. I didn't want to think about finances, not while grieving. But now My grief had turned into something sharper, resolve. I quietly called our old lawyer, Mr. Weller. He had retired, but his daughter Marianne had taken over the firm. She remembered me from childhood visits to the office and agreed to meet the next day. I didn't tell Grace or Clarissa. I told them I was going to the library, and neither looked up from their phones. At Marianne's office, I placed the envelope on her desk. "I think my daughter-in-law is hiding something," I said simply. Marianne raised an eyebrow, then opened the documents with practiced care. The safety deposit box had the original trust papers Henry and I signed years ago. There was a codicil too, one Henry had added shortly before he passed. It specified that the house we lived in was to remain in my name until my death, and that I would be entitled to live there peacefully free from interference. But there was more. Henry had also added a clause that restricted any significant changes to the deed or refinancing without my written consent. A clause Grace had never mentioned. A clause Clarissa had certainly never seen. My hands trembled as I read the documents. I had legal ground more than I ever thought. Marianne offered to investigate whether Grace had refinanced or used the property as collateral without my knowledge. "I can do a quiet title check subpoena bank activity and look into Clarissa's recent purchases," she said. "But Lorraine, are you ready for what this might uncover?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, I've lived in fear long enough." In the days that followed, I began to quietly reclaim pieces of myself. I went upstairs more often not to argue, but simply to exist. I made tea in the kitchen. I watered the houseplants I once planted. When Clarissa commented snidely that the help is back upstairs, I didn't flinch. I just looked her in the eye and said, "Yes, I am." At night, I documented everything. I recorded conversations when Clarissa berated me, saving the audio on a cloud folder Marianne had access to. I noted timestamps, context, tone. I became an archivist of my own mistreatment. Carol, my friend in Maine, called every few days. She sent me books on elder rights and legal empowerment. She even connected me to an advocacy group that offered free legal guidance to women in vulnerable living situations. Each day, I reclaimed a little more space. And still, I said nothing directly to Grace. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. I didn't beg. I moved like still water, quiet, patient, inevitable. Then one morning, while organizing old photo albums in the basement, I found a letter Henry had written to me and never sent. Dated 6 months before his passing, it read, "If you're reading this, Lorraine, it means I wasn't strong enough to protect you from what I feared might come. I hope I'm wrong about Grace and Clarissa. But if I'm not, please fight. Don't disappear. You matter." I clutched the letter to my chest and whispered, "I'm fighting Henry. I'm not going anywhere." The basement no longer felt like a prison. It was now a war room, and the silence. It was my greatest weapon. The confrontation didn't happen in a blaze of fury. It happened in the kitchen beneath the hum of the refrigerator and the soft clinking of breakfast plates. It was Saturday morning, and Clarissa had guests over colleagues from her firm, and I had dared to come upstairs to get a glass of water. She glanced at me annoyed. One of her guests smiled politely and said, "Is that your housekeeper? She looks familiar." Clarissa chuckled without missing a beat. "No, that's just the help. Lives downstairs. Part of the arrangement." The room went quiet. I didn't speak. I just stood there, water glass in hand, staring at her. Then I turned to Grace, who was pretending not to hear. "Grace," I said calmly, "can we talk privately?" She rolled her eyes. "Now." I nodded. "Now." She followed me into the sunroom, a space Henry and I had once used to read the morning papers and drink coffee. I closed the glass door behind us and placed a folder gently on the table. This is a copy of the original trust Henry and I signed, I said, including the codicil he added before he died. Grace blinked, then narrowed her eyes. What are you trying to say? I'm saying I know what you did, I replied. You used the house as collateral for a business loan. Without my consent, that's fraud. She flushed, then stammered, That's ridiculous. You're confused. You're… Stop, I said quietly. Marianne found the paperwork, the loan documents. You forged my initials. I could press charges. Her face went pale. You wouldn't. I haven't, I replied. Yet. We stood in silence. Through the glass wall, I could see Clarissa laughing in the kitchen. I felt no fear anymore. I don't want to ruin your life, Grace. I continued, but I will no longer let you erase mine. She scoffed. What do you want then, money? I shook my head. Respect. And for you to tell your daughter the truth. About everything. About who owns this house. About what you did. Grace was quiet for a long time, and then the shouting began. Clarissa, curious about the long silence, flung open. The sunroom door saw the folder and snapped. What's going on? I turned to her. You've called me the help long enough, I said. But I'm not the maid. I'm your grandmother. And this house, it's mine. Clarissa laughed, high brittle disbelief in every syllable. You're joking. Grace didn't laugh. Her silence said everything. Then I opened my phone, tapped the screen, and let the audio play. Clarissa's voice rang through the room recordings of her insults, her mockery, the moment she called me a burden to remove. Clarissa's face drained of colour. You recorded me. I documented the truth, I replied. Because you've rewritten it for too long. She stormed out of the room. Grace sank into the chair, burying her face in her hands. What do you want from me, Lorraine? I want you to remember that I raised your children, stood by your husband, and built this life with my own hands. I want my dignity back. And I want the upstairs bedroom returned. Today. For the first time in years, Grace didn't argue. She just nodded. It was done. But this wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. That night, I sat by the window in my rightful bedroom, staring out at the moonlight dancing on the garden Henry once pruned by hand. I had not cried, not yet, not because the hurt was gone, but because something steadier had taken its place, clarity. The next morning, I called our family accountant, Mr. Talbot, a kind man in his 60s who had worked with Henry for decades. It's time, I told him. I want to reclaim full control over the family accounts, the deed, and the trust. There was a pause on the other end. Then I was waiting for this call, Mrs. Lorraine. Within a week, Clarissa's allowance was suspended. Grace's auto deposits ceased. The credit cards that bore my name but funded their lavish brunches were deactivated. I signed documents undoing the power of attorney Grace had sneakily filed a year after Henry passed without telling me. Legally, financially, symbolically, I was no longer the help. I was the woman who wrote the checks. And I was done writing them. Clarissa found out first. She stormed into the kitchen in a fury one evening. My card got declined at the spa. What is going on? I calmly sipped my tea. You'll have to ask your mother. She turned on Grace, who was already pale. Did she cut us off? Tell me she didn't. Grace avoided her eyes. Clarissa's voice rose like thunder. You let her humiliate us like this. No, I said sharply, placing my teacup down. I let you humiliate me for years, and now I'm finished playing that role. Clarissa's rage was immediate and theatrical. You're a bitter old woman. That's why Grandpa left you nothing. I smiled. That's not true. Henry left me everything. I just stayed silent long enough for you both to believe the lies you created. She stood frozen, as if slapped by words sharper than any hand. Then she left the room without another word. Grace followed quietly behind her. In the days that followed, the house became quieter. Meals were eaten separately. Clarissa started staying out late, and Grace seemed to shrink into herself, avoiding my gaze. But I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I planted tomatoes in the backyard. I repaired Henry's old birdhouse. I reconnected with Marianne over coffee and laughed for the first time in what felt like years. Then came the letter from Clarissa's college. Tuition was due. I folded it neatly and placed it in an envelope marked, "Ask your mother." I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was teaching them reality. That love isn't measured in what you can extract from someone. And that silence is not surrender. By the end of that week, I knew the tide had truly turned. Grace came into the kitchen one morning, her voice hollow. "Lorraine, what will you do next?" I looked up from my journal. "Something I should have done years ago." She nodded slowly. "Are you leaving?" "Not just yet," I said, "but I will." Her eyes welled, but she didn't speak. For the first time, I saw not the daughter-in-law who tried to erase me, but the woman who had lost her way, and maybe deep down feared losing everything she'd built on a foundation of control. But I wasn't her enemy. I was simply no longer her victim. I didn't leave immediately. I needed time. Not for them, but for me. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to ask, what did I want? Not what Grace demanded. Not what Clarissa expected. Not even what Henry would have advised. Just me, Lorraine, a woman who had once dreamed of opening a bookstore, who used to write poetry, who loved lemon meringue pie and the scent of old books. So I began again. I moved out quietly 2 months later. No drama, no boxes stacked in anger. Just a polite note on the fridge I've gone to find the parts of myself you tried to bury. I didn't leave an address. I stayed with Marianne for a while. Her cottage on the edge of town overlooked a small lake, and the air there was different, clean, unburdened. We spent hours reminiscing, laughing, crying. She reminded me of who I used to be before I became a shadow in someone else's house. With her help, I launched a small online vintage bookstore using the money I'd quietly pulled from my savings. It started as a passion project, something for me. But within months, it gained traction. Readers from all over the country ordered from Lorraine's library. And with every package I wrapped, every handwritten thank you note I signed, I felt myself reclaiming my dignity one customer at a time. I even joined a writing circle. We met every Thursday at the library, a group of women, most in their 60s, all with stories they'd waited decades to tell. Mine wasn't the only one that involved being pushed aside, forgotten, underestimated. But mine was one I now told with clarity, not shame. It was in one of those meetings that I met Angela, a young lawyer who specialized in elder rights and estate protection. When I told her my story, she listened without interruption. Then she said something that shifted everything. "What happened to you isn't uncommon, but the way you handled it with silence, then strength, is rare. Have you thought about telling this story publicly?" I hadn't. Not seriously, but the idea stayed with me. One morning, as I was pruning Marianne's roses, Grace called. I let it ring. Then Clarissa texted, "Can you help me write my college application essay about resilience?" I smiled. Resilience. I didn't reply. I simply opened my journal and began to write again, not just for myself, but maybe for women like me, who'd been erased and wanted to step back into their own stories. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't broken. I was becoming whole. And that scared them more than anything I could have said or done. It was late autumn when I received the envelope. Thick cream paper, my name handwritten in blue ink, not Clarissa's handwriting, but Henry's. The envelope had been sealed nearly a year ago, long before his final hospitalization. Inside was a letter and a notarized copy of his original will. The real one. I read it 3 times. Not for clarity, the instructions were clear. It was emotion I couldn't process. Everything he promised me, the house, a share of the vineyard we had quietly invested in, together the security fund he once said would always be yours, was there untouched, honored. There were handwritten notes in the margins, little jokes, words of affection. Tell Clarissa to take the front garden seriously. The rosemary is hers, but the roses are always yours. Tears blurred the words. Then came the fury. Clarissa had rewritten the new will with Grace's help. She'd manipulated a grieving man disoriented and sedated into signing away what wasn't hers to touch. What they filed in court had conveniently replaced this original until now. Angela was stunned. This changes everything she said. We can file a contestation immediately. This isn't just forgery, it's fraud coercion. You could press criminal charges. I said nothing for a long time. Angela watched me closely. You're thinking of not doing it, aren't you? I don't want revenge, I finally said. I want truth. But I also want peace. She nodded. Then let's aim for both. When the lawsuit was filed, it made local news. Small-town gossip spreads faster than fire in a hay barn. Widow Sue's daughter-in-law over forged will, the headlines read. I didn't speak to the press, but Grace and Clarissa did, framing me as confused, vengeful, lonely. But the truth came out, as truth often does. The notary who witnessed the original will confirmed it. A nurse who had worked with Henry testified about his lucidity during his final days. Emails surfaced messages that showed Clarissa's impatience, her pressure. Grace's signature forged. It unraveled thread by thread. But it was the courtroom moment that divided everyone, even my own community. When asked why I was pursuing the case, I simply said, because I was there when that house was built. Because I wiped my son's nose and paid his tuition and baked his favorite cake until he moved out. Because I was told to sit quietly in the background, and I did, until they made me disappear. Some clapped, others called it selfish. There were whispers. She's going after her own blood. It's just a house, let it go. She should forgive and move on. But I wasn't seeking vengeance. I was reclaiming voice. And maybe that's what made people uncomfortable. A quiet woman standing tall. A forgotten figure refusing to vanish. I didn't want to ruin Clarissa. I didn't want to destroy Grace. But I also wasn't going to let them write the ending of my story. So I took back the pen and wrote something none of them expected. The verdict came quietly in a small courtroom on a rainy Thursday. The judge ruled in my favor. The original will was reinstated. Clarissa's version was deemed invalid, and the assets she had already claimed were to be returned. She didn't look at me when the ruling was read. Grace wasn't there. Henry's name was never once said with warmth during the proceedings, only referenced as the deceased or Mr. Langston. It struck me how cold the world could become when legacy was reduced to paperwork and probate. The house came back into my name. The vineyard shares were restored. The financial accounts Clarissa had drained would be repaid over time, a court order, not a request. And still I didn't smile, because victory felt heavy. I stood on the front porch of the house that once felt like home and watched a moving truck drive away with Clarissa's final boxes. She hadn't spoken to me since the trial. Not a word. Only a look, once hollow, unreadable. She left behind a single item on the kitchen counter, a photograph of Henry holding Grace when she was 3. Tucked in the back was a torn note scrawled hastily. She doesn't understand. Maybe one day. I placed the frame on the mantel, but the note I slipped into a drawer. I wasn't ready to hold those words close. Weeks passed. Autumn bled into winter. I replanted the roses in the front garden just like Henry would have wanted. And one evening, as frost dusted the windows, the doorbell rang. It was Grace. Her face had changed, not just aged, but softened. She held a small white box in her gloved hands. "I don't know why I came," she said, avoiding eye contact. I remember the way you used to make hot chocolate, and I wondered if maybe you still do." I let her in. We didn't speak about the trial, or Clarissa, or Henry. We just sat in the living room, the silence wrapped in old furniture and faint cinnamon scents. I made the hot chocolate. She drank it slowly. "I don't know what Mum told me to believe," Grace said, barely above a whisper. "But I remember who you were when I was little. You used to hold my hand in the parking lot. You used to fix the ribbons in my hair. Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. You're always welcome here," I said, setting down her cup. She nodded. "Maybe we could start again." I didn't answer. Not with words. I simply placed a knitted scarf in her lap, the same one I had started making for her birthday years ago, but never had a chance to give. She wrapped it around her neck. Outside, the wind howled against the glass. But inside, it was still. Not a happy ending, but maybe a new beginning. Not forgiveness, but maybe recognition. And as she stepped out the door, turning back once to wave, I whispered to no one in particular. "I didn't choose the house. I chose not to be erased. I am Evelyn Langston. And I am still here." If you've ever stood at the edge of your own family and felt like a stranger in the home you helped build, if you've ever been written out, pushed aside, or told your worth had expired, then you understand my story better than anyone else ever could. Let me ask you this. Have you ever been treated like the help in a house where you were once the heart? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. I read every city name, every story, every tear hidden between lines. Your words matter. And if my story resonated with you, if you found yourself nodding, aching, or whispering, "That's me," please subscribe to this channel. There's more to come. More stories, more truth, more moments where we stop being silent, because no one deserves to be forgotten. And if you're still reading this, know you're not alone. We are many, we are strong, and we are still here.